So welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I am joining you all the way from Madison, Wisconsin. It is amazing to be here with you all today. So we are going to be discussing supporting historical marginalized families and peer support, navigating cultural nuances and systemic barriers. My name is Dominique Christian. I am a state of Wisconsin certified peer specialist, as well as a state of Wisconsin parent peer specialist, and I am certified to facilitate both curriculums for the state of Wisconsin. And so I spend a fair amount of my time facilitating training such as this one, whether it be in person or virtually, that centers the peer support workforce here in the state of Wisconsin. So thank you for joining me today. I hope at some point some of you may join me with your video on so we can engage in a conversation and do what you need to take care of yourself in this space. So we are going to keep moving for the sake of time. I have a lot of information to share with you all. Hello, Christina. So introduction is we are going to be discussing ways to equip you all as peer workers with the tools to better support marginalized families. We are going to be talking about fostering understanding of cultural dynamics in diverse family structures, as well as increase awareness of the risks in navigating carceral systems like Child Protective Service. I'm going to pause for a moment. Casey, I no longer see the closed caption. Are you able to see the closed caption?
No, I'm not. Let me make sure those are on.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to keep going. Some key things that you all will see come up is decentering norms, breaking away from whiteness, and elevating culturally relevant practices for the folks that you are supporting in your community. So the importance of culture. So as you all know, culture is significantly important in how we show up and support folks in our communities. So culture refers to the beliefs, customs, values, and practices shared by a group of people. Culture influences how families understand the world, how they solve problems, and how they engage in relationships. And that's whether it's intimate partner relationships, relationships with friends and family members, and also relationships with the folks that they care for, whether it's children, young adults, or aging adults. So in peer work, understanding culture is essential because it shapes how people cope with adversity, express emotions, and make decisions. For historically marginalized families, cultural values may differ significantly from dominant cultural society norms. To recognizing these differences without judgment is crucial in providing effective support. So when we're thinking about working with folks from many different cultures, when working with marginalized families specifically, it's vital to approach each family through the lens to which that is specific to their cultural context, rather than assuming a sort of like one size fit all model. Families' reactions to trauma, mental health challenges, and child rearing are often intertwined with their cultural upbringing and experiences. And so when we think about culture, we have to think about culture from not this box type of approach, but how does each individual define, how would they describe their culture? And the reason why that is important is because we have to understand that even if I do identify as a Black woman who has experienced childhood traumas that was linked to impoverishment, growing up in a single parent home. So those are all intersecting identities that would make up how I define what my culture is. And so in our role as peer workers, we have to avoid assuming familiarity with the family's cultural norms based solely off of ethnicity and race. Instead, we have to work to employ an approach of culture, cultural humility. So a lot of us may have heard terms like cultural competence, And the reason why cultural competence can be problematic in a sense is because none of us can be fully competent in the type of culture to which a family defines their family dynamic. And so, going back to this idea that I do identify as a Black woman, when I'm providing direct supportive services in our community here in Wisconsin, I am very intentional with asking very specific questions as it relates to someone's culture. Because just because I identify as a Black woman, that doesn't mean that the next person who identifies as a Black woman has the same or even similar understandings of cultural context or background, or that we share similarities in our beliefs and ideals just because we both identify as Black women. So we have to acknowledge diversity within marginalized communities. So while a family may share ethnic, racial, or geographic backgrounds with other marginalized communities, there are always individual differences. Factors like migration history, socioeconomic status, one's religious beliefs or maybe spiritual beliefs, and personal experiences of oppression which influences our unique cultural dynamics. It is also important to recognize that families within marginalized groups may have different experiences of language barriers, generational differences, individual preferences that affect our family dynamics. So I'm going to pause for just a brief moment and ask folks if there are any lingering questions just based off of what I have shared thus far. And yeah, what questions do you all have, if any? If you don't have any, that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to keep going again for the sake of time and knowing that there's a lot of information to cover. So some examples that we want to consider is diversity within African American, Latinx, or Indigenous communities. Some families may have strong connections to cultural traditions, while others may have adopted the westernized or hybrid cultural practices. These differences do require peer workers to avoid blanket assumptions and instead inquire with curiosity and openness. And so when you think about curiosity and entering into spaces with our peers with a sense of open-mindedness, it is going to be crucial to also be acknowledging our biases that might show up as someone share with us what their culture is. So some actionable steps that peer workers can do is what we've talked about, right? So asking open-ended questions that allow for families to share their cultural background, values, and practices. And so one example of this could be, tell me about your family's traditions and how they guide your daily life. So this approach is going to allow us to avoid assumptions and build trust. So I'm going to, put it out there that if there are some folks that are willing to share, like some examples of open questions that you might have in the back of your mind, or some open questions that you might already use in practice to support a peer and becoming more comfortable with you and sharing more about their culture. So what are some examples of open questions that you all might use on a day-to-day basis to connect with your peer and learn more about their culture? And feel free to unmute yourself. You can keep your camera off during that time as you speak. Hi, Linda.
Oh, hi. I have two computers going because my big screen doesn't have a camera, but my little one does. So, hi.
Hello.
I am working with a family that is Islamic. And I seriously did about 2 hours of research to just understand a little bit about the culture. And wouldn't you know it, they throw something in there that I had no idea what that was, how it affected them. And I just simply said to them that, I'm really not familiar with that. Would you mind explaining it to me so I get a better understanding of how that works in your home? And they were so happy and they were like, yeah, let me explain it. And then they were able to explain it. So I find that over the years, I've been doing this 15 years now, that if I just simply say that I'm not familiar, and can you explain a little bit more so I can understand? Everybody seems to be real willing to do that and real willing to just explain it, and which helps. And it also creates a better engagement and a better bond, especially as peers, because you're not higher than them. You're kind of like, just explain it.
Thank you for that, Linda. That's beautifully spoken, simply because what it sounds like you did for your peer is you opened up this door, this avenue for them to be able to bring their understanding of their culture into the space. Yes, we got Google. Yes, we got books. And also we have to understand who's providing this information on Google. Where's the information coming from the books? Were these individuals from this particular culture brought to the table before these sort of resources for us to self-educate ourselves brought into the space? So when you do that, it really does give this idea that their voice matters. So even though you did, this 12-hour, right, self-educating adventure, right, you still allow for them to pour into the connection you were looking to make with them. And I also love that you brought in this idea of mutuality into the space as well. So thank you for sharing that, Linda.
You're welcome.
So as you find that you have things that you would like to share, I'm all for like having this be a communication or a conversation as opposed to me speaking so much information into you all. So thank you again, Linda. So when we think about moving beyond cultural awareness to cultural humility, so the awareness piece comes from exactly like Linda talked about, right? Linda was very intentional with identifying that I'm working with a family that I don't know much about and I'm willing to learn. And I love that also how Linda approached this, because Linda didn't make it the responsibility of the peer or the family that she's supporting or serving to give her all of the information. It was like, let me do the background work so that I can come in with some knowledge and still be open to this idea that they may find that some of the cultural norms that Linda read about or learned about is still vastly different than how they view their family dynamic. So thank you. So cultural awareness is just the first step, right? Cultural humility allows for us to go beyond mere understanding by incorporating a lifelong commitment to self-reflection, learning, and challenging our personal biases. Cultural humility requires peer workers to consistently reflect on their own cultural lens and bias, especially when working with families whose experiences differ from their own. And so I love peer work for all of us because it really allows for us to take a step back, not feel like we have to know everything because no one person is an expert on any culture. In fact, I would even take it a step further to say that you all are not experts on your culture, the generalized idea of the culture to which you identify with as well. It is when we start to allow for ourselves to experience discomfort in this idea of learning to best serve our community and the families we serve as individuals. And even when you think about a family dynamic, recognizing that there's individualism in each one of those persons that make up that family. So in peer support, cultural humility emphasizes that we are not experts in anyone else's experience, but rather we are learners and we must continually listen and adapt to the needs of those that we support. And how we do that is sometimes I might show up in a space and I might say, I may not fully understand your family's experiences, but I am here to listen and to learn. So what should I know to better support you? And so that, again, that's another one of those open-ended questions that allows for us to center the peer's voice while remaining curious and being open to the discomfort that we experience as we learn, especially if we go into spaces feeling like we already knew something. And in fact, this peer may share something totally different from what you understood to be the truth. So when we think about this idea of decentering the idea of a two-parent household as the norm, we have to think about the vast majority of people that we serve when it comes to peer support work. So the idea of the two-parent household as the default or norm has deep historical, as we know, cultural and societal roots. This model often portrayed as the ideal family structure primarily consists of two heterosexual married parents raising their biological children. It is reinforced through various institutions such as the educational system, the media, and policy, such as, so when we think about historical alignment to the nuclear family with ideas of stability, success, and moral order. However, this concept is not universally acceptable or applicable and can sometimes marginalize or devalue other family structures. So for me, as I talked about in the beginning, I grew up in a single parent home. I do have two parents. One of them was absent for various different reasons. And so when I approach this idea of parent-peer support, as I provide direct supportive services, it is my goal to also understand that when there are two parents in a specific family dynamic that's living in one household, I also have to do the work up front to recognize the judgment and the bias that might shows up, because I have to realize that even those two adults that's leading that family dynamic, they come from two different worlds. That means they have two different experiences, two different upbringings, probably two different understandings of the parental role as well. And so we'll talk about that more as we go, and you all start to engage in conversation. But the historical context of the two-parent household emerged as the societal idea. This goes all the way back to post-World War II era, particularly in Western countries, where the nuclear family became a symbol of post-war prosperity and social order. More specifically in the United States, though, the rise of suburbanization, along with government policies such as the GI Bill, which provided economic benefits primarily to predominantly white families in this model. So television, advertising, and other forms of media further reinforced the nuclear family as synonymous with the American dream. So when I think about the historical dynamics of our families that immigrated into the United States and this need for them to assimilate, thinking about how they had to leave pieces of their culture behind in order to assimilate, to either remain safe in the communities to which they were trying to grow accustomed to, or build their idea of a family into that particular culture or space, which didn't allow for them to be authentic in their parenting style, which would have been unique to them in that specific community that they traveled into. So then there comes like this idea, when you take the historical context, you have to also consider the cultural and racial bias that shows up as well. So this notion of a two-parent household is also tied into Eurocentric and patriarchal values. In cultures where communal and extended family structures are more common. So when we think about indigenous families, African-American families, African families, Latinx, and Asian communities, the insistence on the nuclear model can be very dismissive. It can invalidate and decenter the idea of strength-based approaches within these family systems. So the idea that stability and success are best achieved through a two-parent household ignores the diversity of family norms that can provide nurturing environments for children. For me, that it was just that. Although I grew up in a single-parent household, the nurturing and the attention that I received from my mother for me was very unmatched. Now, although my idea of growing up in a single parent household, specifically that's led by a Black woman, was something that I imagine my mom had to navigate differently than other single-led households by women, because of all of the other dynamics that come along with it. And those are going to come up as we continue on into this sort of training that we are all in. So for Black families, the two-parent household model has often been framed within deficit narratives. So throughout history, Black families in the United States have been pathologized, particularly through policies and social narratives that blame Black single mothers for societal issues, rather than recognizing the impact of systemic racism, economic inequality, and other barriers. So there's a report that came out in 1965. And this report, I do not know how to pronounce this, but I'm going to try to do my best. It is the Moynihan report that came out in 1965 that reinforced this idea that disintegration of the Black family due to single motherhood was at the core of poverty and other social problems, which further entrenched the idea of the two-parent model as the only way forward for societal health. And so when I think about that, and I think about this report and I take it into consideration, I shouldn't be here amongst your group of folks right now, because of the stigma and the bias that came along with this idea of growing up in a single parent household, and the extra layer of being a single Black mother, and trying to tackle motherhood alone, like on a systemic level based off of statistics. I shouldn't be where I am today. So when we think about social and economic policy, government policies often reflect and perpetuate this idea. So welfare policies, tax incentives for married couples specifically, and certain housing assistance programs favor traditional two-parent households. A great example of this is many family-based government benefits or tax breaks are structured around marital status, which can economically disadvantage single-parent households, LGBTQ plus families, and other non-traditional families. The reality is, when it is regarding family diversity, families take many shapes. The rise of single-parent households, co-parenting across households, same-sex parents, extended family networks, foster families, and chosen family demonstrates that a wide variety of structures can successfully raise children and build healthy, supportive environments. These families often provide the same, if not greater, levels to broader networks of care that extend beyond just two parents. And so we have to understand that even though our biases might tell us that a two-parent household is better, a two-parent household, heterosexual relationship is better than all these others, we have to take a step back and understand that that might not be the truth for so many people, especially when there's an opportunity to consider how domestic violence plays a role sometimes in two-parent households. And what does that look like? How does that impact the upbringing of the children that we look to support? So the impact on marginalized communities is that the insistence on a two-parent family as the default can harm marginalized communities, particularly single mothers, folks from LGBTQ plus families, and non-traditional caregivers, by forcing them to measure themselves against a standard that may not fit their circumstances. This framing can perpetuate feelings of inadequacy or pressure to conform to an ideal that is out of reach due to systemic issues such as poverty, discrimination, and lack of social support. So it is on us to decenter the two-parent model, to move beyond the two-parent household as the default. There needs to be a recognition of the strengths and validity of diverse family structures. Policy reform should focus on the needs of all types of families. That plays a big part in our role as peer specialists, because that is a part of our role to advocate for the needs of the folks that we serve outside of the direct one-on-one advocacy. We have to look at advocacy around systems change, and et cetera. So social work, healthcare, education, and other fields should also adopt more inclusive frameworks that honor the diverse ways that people create family and support each other. So understanding child rearing expectations tied to whiteness. Traditional child rearing practices in many societies, especially in Western contexts, are often deeply rooted in white middle-class norms. These norms have historically influenced ideas about what constitutes good parenting, shaping societal expectations around family dynamics, discipline, educational practices, and the emotional development of children. So, ways that these norms manifest. The idealized version of the nuclear family with two married parents, often one breadwinner and then one caretaker, is a construct based on white middle-class values. This model assumes that stability and proper upbringing require a two-parent structure, often devaluing or stigmatizing single-parent, multi-generational, or non-traditional family arrangements, which are more common in many Black, Indigenous, and immigration communities. These family structures may offer different but equally valuable forms of support and caregiving. Individualism over collectivism. So white middle-class parenting tends to emphasize individualism, self-sufficiency, and independence. Children are often encouraged to focus on their personal achievements and autonomy in an elder age, where in contrast, many cultures emphasize collectivism, where children are raised within a broader community and a family network, prioritizing shared responsibility and interdependence. White middle-class norms often misinterpret these collectivist approaches as a lack of independence or over-reliance on family supports. I'd experienced this when I had to engage or interact with Child Protective Services as a single parent, where they didn't see the value in the cultural norms that I was using to influence how my children were brought up in the world. I didn't have access to this idea of becoming married, identifying a partner, becoming married, and bringing someone into my home, because there were other things that were impacting me as an individual outside of this idea of being a parent. And so that needed to be acknowledged. But because of how the system is set up, it could not be acknowledged. And so I was treated and spoken to in a different way because I didn't have access to our traditional norm when it comes to raising a family and being mentally, physically, and emotionally available to support kids to becoming this idea of independent or ready to take on the world once they outgrew our family home. So the emphasis on structured discipline. So many white middle-class families emphasize child rearing practices that involve scheduled routines, organized extracurricular activities, and structured forms of discipline, such as timeouts or taking away privileges. These approaches can pathologize or stigmatize other forms of child discipline, such as communal decision-making, storytelling as guidance, or other culturally specific practices. These norms often neglect the importance of flexibility and adaptability that exist in many marginalized communities where resources and external circumstances vary greatly. Focusing on emotional expression. Again, drawing off of our traditional way of raising families. So white middle-class norms often encourage open emotional expression in children, valuing communication over feelings, therapy, and emotional support. While these are important aspects of child development, they do not always align with cultures that may have different approaches to expressing emotions. For instance, many communities value emotional restraint. I also think about that from the context of how young boys are raised in our in various different cultures, that they can't show emotion. They're not allowed to cry. They're not allowed to do many of these things that folks who identify as a young girl, female woman have access to, and how problematic that is, especially when you think about individualism within a cultural makeup as it relates to an individualized family. In addition to that, we have to consider educational achievement. So the expectation of educational achievement is often seen through a narrow lens that values academic success as defined by Western schooling systems. White middle-class parents may place significant emphasis on formal education, extracurriculars, and college attendance as markers of success, while families from different backgrounds may prioritize practical life skills, community involvement, or other forms of learning that are equally significant in preparing children for adulthood. Discipline and cultural punishment. So white middle-class norms are often opposes corporal punishment, which can lead to judgment and misunderstandings of families who use physical discipline. So in many communities, physical discipline is a culturally accepted form of maintaining authority and control. While debates about the effects of corporal punishment exist, dismissing it without understanding the cultural context can alienate families who feel their practices are misunderstood and criminalized. And that oftentimes shows up in families of color. Me speaking from my very Black experience, how I navigate this world, I have seen over my lifetime many children be removed from their family, what they know as their norm, because of the judgment that plays a role in how parents decide to discipline their children. And it's interesting because while one group of folks may see that timeouts are better than a physical whooping, if you will, we also have to take a step back and think about that. The psychological impact that happens, the potential psychological impact that can happen when a child is called to a timeout. And some of these timeouts might be stand in the corner and face the wall. Stand and have your arms out. You can't do anything but have those arms out. You know, so we have to think, we have to take a step back and think those might be norms. And until we create a space where we are willing to go back as one adult to another to our adult children and ask them, what was the impact on my choice of discipline? We can't make the decision that one form of punishment is far better than the other. Because again, in those situations, the experience is vastly different from one child to another. So stigma against extended families. So many cultures outside the white middle class norm, child rearing is shared responsibility with grandparents, aunts, uncles, and even neighbors playing significant roles. When I think about that statement, I think about this idea that it takes a village, right? It takes a village to raise a child, a single child. And that village could be any number of different identities, whether it is friends that your children now call aunt and uncle. In peer roles, we don't get to question someone's familial makeup because there's no blood connection. There are so many people who navigate this world who don't have access to the traditional idea of family because they might have been removed from their home for any variation of reasons. And so now their family is not even a blood connection. So again, just thinking about how we judge one acceptable idea of how families are become families versus another. So the white middle class focus on nuclear families, often stigmatizing this extended family involvement as unnecessary or a sign of economic instability, rather than recognizing it as a strength in raising well-rounded children who benefit from diverse influences and caregivers. The institutional sort of bias and child protective services is influenced from white middle class norms in child rearing practices, which extends into institutional systems like child protective services. Families from marginalized communities, especially Black and Indigenous families, are often judged against these norms and are more likely to be deemed neglectful or abusive for failing to conform. For example, cultural norms around the age at which children are given independence, such as being left unsupervised for short periods, may differ, but can be misconstrued as neglect in legal contexts dominated by white middle class values. There's also this idea of parentification that shows up, that is oftentimes spoken about when there is a Black family that is integrated into any carceral setting or system that is now being given the permission to judge based off of the idea of the right way to parent. So in conclusion, traditional child rearing practices shaped by white middle class norms often exclude or devalue the diverse ways in which families from different racial, cultural, and economic backgrounds raise their children. These norms prioritize individualism, structured discipline, and a narrow understanding of success, often leading to marginalization of collective, flexible, and culturally specific approaches to parenting. Addressing these biases involves embracing a broader perspective on what constitutes healthy child rearing, one that honors and respects cultural diversity and the unique needs of families. So I want to pause because that was a lot. I keep seeing my indicator that my screen is being shared move down just a tad bit. So if folks are putting anything into the chat, I should have said this earlier, my apologies. I cannot see the chat. So if you would please, if you're interested, use this as an opportunity to unmute yourself and share with me any thoughts that you might have, ask me any questions that you might have, feel free to do so. So when we think about navigating carceral systems, such as child protective services and beyond, so for me, I also work for our juvenile corrections institution here in Wisconsin. And a lot of the times, these different dynamics will show up in the work that I do within that particular system as well. So outside of child protective services, we have to also consider the criminal justice system as well. So risks involved when marginalized families are connected within these systems. One is biased treatment and racial disparities. So marginalized families, especially Black and Indigenous families, face disproportionate surveillance and removal of children by Child Protective Service. Research shows these communities are more likely to have their parenting decisions scrutinized, often based on bias, assumptions, or systemic racism. Families living in poverty or dealing with housing insecurity may be deemed neglectful, even when the root cause is a lack of resources, not parental incapacity. Criminalization of poverty. Poverty is often mistaken for neglect within child protective service systems. Families struggle with the inadequate housing, food insecurity, or lack of access to health care may be deemed unfit. even though these issues are systemic failures rather than parental shortcomings. The criminalization of poverty leads to higher rates of children being removed in marginalized communities. So the impact on family structures is that CPS involvement often disrupt family structures, perpetuating trauma and breaking apart family units. This could also go back to when you think about substance use within specific marginalized families, right? And how folks' use of substance is oftentimes criminalized. And with criminalization, often leads to incarceration. So the removal of parents, where systems force the idea of single parent dynamics onto the family because how their family manages or deals with life in general is oftentimes, again, scrutinized or judged in a very unfair way because it doesn't look like how our traditional norms says things should look like. So this creates mistrust and re-traumatization for families that does identify as members of marginalized families. So when we think about this idea of mistrust and re-traumatization, people have already experienced significant harm from systemic inequities in other areas such as education, healthcare, or the criminal justice system. Many families become mistrustful of institutions, which can impact their willingness to seek help when needed, fearing further judgment and intervention, that intervention being children being removed from the home, or sometimes being forced into this idea that you're not ready to care for your children. So one parent might receive full custody over the children as opposed to the other. Elevated risks of carceral systems. So Child Protective Service involvement often serves as a gateway to carceral systems, increasing the risk of entanglement with law enforcement and the criminal justice system. For Black families in particular, involvement with Child Protective Service can lead to racialized policing of family dynamics and increased vulnerability to legal consequences. So cultural misunderstandings would include child welfare systems often operate based on white middle-class cultural norms that may not align with the realities of marginalized families. For example, multi-generational households, communal caregiving, or alternative discipline methods might be seen as deviant or neglectful, when in fact they are culturally relevant and effective family structures. Disproportionate surveillance, we've talked about that, where marginalized families oftentimes are more likely to come into contact with mandated reporters, such as teachers, doctors, social workers, who may have implicit biases. And that's why it's important for us to address those implicit biases as we navigate spaces with individuals who come from a different cultural background. So some guidance for peer support workers: empower your families through education. Educate yourselves, right? Educate yourselves to know and understand how deeply rooted some of these cultural ideals and preferences to how they raise their children shows up and impacts the way that they show up with you and for their children. Promote preventative services. So ask families, are they interested in learning about new or different ways to providing a certain type of support or discipline to their children? And if they're not, taking a step back to check in with yourself to understand what shows up for you when ideas that you might have don't land well for those families. Challenge your biases, other folks' biases, and the deficit-based thinking that occurs when we feel like the way to which someone is parenting their children is not appropriate, it's not acceptable, and it makes you feel some type of way. Support culturally competent practices and build trust with your families. And the only way you build trust with your families is really being intentional with the connection that you have with those family members. So this is just a diagram that talks about the interaction with Child Protective Service. And if you look at this, if you're looking at this diagram, as you can see, there's never a time where a family, so the family that we support should feel like they're in this situation alone. There's never a time. If a family chooses to take on parts of the process alone, that's a decision that they have made. If they don't ask you to take a step back, we have to continue to take the step forward. It is the idea of being a co-conspirator in these family to peer support dynamics and relationships. Sorry. So, identifying and overcome bias in peer support. So, assumptions about neglect. Professionals may assume that lack of resources automatically indicates neglect, when in reality, families from marginalized communities may face systemic barriers such as poverty or discrimination that limit access to resources. For a very long time within our community here in Wisconsin, having access to any sort of resource or support looked like it was based on who you know. And so if you didn't know the right person at the right time, you didn't have access to that resource. Misunderstandings of cultural norms, viewing certain cultural practices or family structures as unusual or incorrect based on the dominant cultural norms. When in reality, cultural norms such as multi-generational households, what we talked about before, differing ideas of child rearing may not align with mainstream expectations, but reflect valid and valuable practices in marginalized communities. Biases related to single parent households. There may be negative assumptions about the stability or capability of a single parent household, particularly for Black and Brown families, when in fact, households are often resilient and capable, right? So just understanding that supporting our families to identify the strengths that come up within their own dynamic is going to be key. Recognizing stereotypical behavior as aggression, right? So stereotyping the behavior as aggression. When sometimes, right, this idea of aggression is fear, frustration with systems. And so how do we support our peers in understanding that? That it is not about their aggressive response. And how do we work with our families to better understand how to deal with systems so that it doesn't impact how they show up as a parent? So how to reflect on one's bias and avoid paternalistic approaches, right? So it is on us to engage in self-reflection. It is always important for us to be self-reflecting. We need to be very intentional with understanding cultural humility as it relates to how we show up for the families that we support. Asking ourselves, am I centering the family's voice, or am I imposing my own assumptions about what's best for them? Challenging stereotypes. Am I viewing this family through a deficit lens, or am I acknowledging their strengths and capacity to overcome these challenges? Avoiding the savior mindset. Am I empowering these families to make their own choices, or am I making decisions for them? Because that's what makes me feel comfortable in the connection. Being committed to continually learning. So what systemic barriers might be contributing to this particular family situation? And how can I support the advocacy for broader community change? This is a check and express yourself tool that I use, that I created for the work that I do out in the community. This is something that I did provide to the folks that you all work with. So if you're interested in taking on this tool, I also provided directions for you to explore and do some self-expression to learn how you're showing up in spaces with your peers, I should say. So building networks of culturally relevant support, connecting marginalized families with resources that reflect their cultural, social, and emotional needs is essential for supporting their well-being. So understanding the culture, social, and emotional needs of marginalized families is significantly important. It is important because their background helps us as service providers to deliver appropriate support that aligns with their values and beliefs, not yours. For example, families may prefer resources that are sensitive to their spiritual or religious practices, or that provide services in their native language. Acknowledging social needs, identifying challenges like household instability, income inequality, barriers to education, so on and so forth. So addressing social needs involve connecting families to resources that are interesting to them, that are important to them, and that feels that it aligns with the goals that they have identified for their family. And also acknowledging the emotional need behind it as well. It is on us as part of workers within community-based organizations to recognize how often deeply embedded in the community some of these policies and traditional norms play out, so that we are not supporting folks that we serve from a culturally relevant lens. So centering strengths of marginalized families. It is important to recognize the resilience and adaptability in marginalized families. There's an incredible amount of resilience with families that have grown up in marginalized communities, that have navigated impoverishment. And so the systems that are set up, we have to be willing to acknowledge that some of the resources are not a good fit for some of these families because of deeply embedded through white supremacy, discriminatory practices and policies, which create social exclusion. We have to do the work in building strong supportive networks, supporting our families in identifying their idea of natural supports, being resourceful for them, supporting them to become resourceful, so independent of a system, and recognizing the perseverance in the face of adversity. So having trust that the families that you all support can overcome the things that they are challenging, by recognizing their inherent strengths, valuing their lived experiences, and collaborating on goal settings, centering their voice. What goals have they identified? And if they've identified them goals, honoring that, celebrating that they even have the mental capacity to even come up with these goals, and ensure that when we are engaging with the families, that we're doing it in a very culturally relevant way. And so, of course, resilience is a thing, right? When we think about resilience, we can't help but to acknowledge that resilience is a requirement. It's not a choice for many people. People will talk about being tired and exhausted from this idea of resilience. So for many Black women, resilience is often viewed as a necessary survival mechanism rather than a personal trait that they opt into. So sometimes it's not something that folks are willing to celebrate. The expectation stems from historical and societal contexts in which Black women have had to endure systemic oppression, racial and gender bias discrimination, and economic inequalities. As a result, resilience is not seen as a strength. The strong Black woman stereotype. It's definitely a stereotype. It's a pervasive image that portrays Black women as inherently strong, emotionally resilient, and capable of overcoming any challenges without the need for help and support. This stereotype is rooted in complex history of slavery, racial discrimination, and patriarchy. While on the surface, the stereotype may appear empowering, it actually diminishes the full range of Black women's humanity. It suggests that Black women are not allowed to show vulnerability, experience weakness, or ask for help. This not only isolates them, but emotionally, it can also have a profound impact on their mental and physical health. The emotional and physical toll of constant resilience. The requirement to always be resilient and embody the strong Black woman trope has significant emotional and physical consequences. In addition to other tropes that exist, the idea that men, people who identify as men or masculine, are not able to show their emotions, how that impacts when you think about different same sex family dynamics, how that shows up and plays a role in how they navigate all of the systems that they have to navigate, the different biases and stereotypes that they are required to navigate as well. And the need for rest and care. We have to do better as service providers to support the people that we serve in understanding the importance of rest and self-care, but not from a space of take care of yourself, because that has become sort of like a buzz statement where oftentimes we have to recognize that not everyone has access to their identified self-care practice. And how do we still show up and honor the need for them to care for themselves is very important as well. So again, a lot of talking coming from my end. I am going to stop sharing my screen. This last slide that I have for you is just some information about who I am and ways to which you can contact me if you have additional questions about the information that was provided here. If you just wanted to connect to talk further about some of the points that I made as well. And so I'm leaving us with a terrible 3 minutes to address any questions that you all have. I see that there are 12 comments in the chat. So some people was checking in about their volume, etc. Thank you very much, Sandra. I have your contact information. I'm going to save that. But what questions do you all have? I know we're out of time. I don't know what that looks like for folks. What questions do you all have? Go ahead, Christina.
Hi, I don't really have any questions because a lot of this I already knew, but I feel like in New York City, especially the I know the commissioner very well of ACS, and he has taken on a very preventive stance when it comes to child welfare. I'm part of a parent advisory committee that works very closely with the commissioner and every division of ACS, making recommendations. We have to see things before they are even disseminated to anybody else, which I think is a great thing. But I also think you made a lot of very valid points, especially when it comes to how child welfare used to deal with people, and still does for some, because we can't say across the board everybody gets the same treatment, right? Because poverty does play a major impact on how people are treated, and it's a shame. But the one thing that we are seeing in New York City, especially with the asylum seekers, is they're coming here with their own way of living, and a lot of times they're becoming known to ACS because they're used to living a totally different lifestyle, and that's where because a lot of our parent workers, they work with these cohort of individuals, and this is where they play an important role. Because if we're going to say that we're family focused and family oriented, then that means that we have to push all of everything that you're saying. We have to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to ensure that they're educated as to the practices here, because they just got here, and that they're connected to the resources they need so that they can be successful now that they are here. And also for the families that we work with, making sure that, like you said, they know how to fight for themselves, right? and that they know their rights. Right now in New York City, they have rights at the front door. As soon as a CPS worker comes through the door, they're supposed to hand you a letter. It's supposed to tell you your rights. They're supposed to make sure you have a clear understanding of that. And if it's not being done, then people, you know what I'm saying? I've asked people to call me and let me know, because I will go back and push back. That's what my role as an advocate is to do. So I thank you for your presentation. I think it was great.
Thank you, Christina. I appreciate the affirmation. Hand clap to the letter at the door situation. I love to hear about these things because that's something that most communities needs to implement. Like, is there a requirement that we allow some folks from institutions into our homes, and what does that look like for us to advocate for ourselves right up front? So I love that. Sandra did ask for my PowerPoint slide. And Casey, I can send you the updated one. Certainly, folks are welcome to the PowerPoint slide if it's something that you're interested in, to like read deeper into some of the things that I shared, because an hour is never enough for me. I don't know if Tim Sombers told you all, I talk a lot. And so we kind of knew that I was going to run out of time here. But yes, I can share. Casey can definitely share my PowerPoint with you all.
Yeah, thanks, Dominique. I can add that to the resources in the course page. So once the this recording is up and we send that link out, you'll be able to click on that and see the recording as well as the resources.
Perfect. Well, I see Robert is like, I got to run to another meeting. I don't want to hold you all because I don't know what your next hour looks like. I appreciate you all showing up into this space and being willing to navigate sort of a different type of perspective around marginalized communities, different family dynamics and makeups, and child rearing. Again, if you would like to reach out to me, Casey can also provide my contact information as well. But I love creating space and opportunities like this. And so I appreciate you all for joining me. Have a great day.